Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, April 29th, 2020. And today, here at the Secret Studio, we observe the 10th birthday of our beloved studio dog, Chloe. She keeps me company here every day, has never bitten the postal worker or the FedEx guy, but they are all afraid of this little 15-pound critter. So for my East Coast listeners who like to grab this in the early evening, I'm recording a little bit late today. Just a lot of news to review before I can sit down and comment on it. But let's dive in, because I'm pleased to report that Americans are wary of big tech, the data they collect, and even with the deep fears that people have of carrying the coronavirus, nearly 3 in 5 Americans are either unable or unwilling to use the contact tracing system that involves smartphones and tracking people whose phones came close to your phone, the system that's under development by Google and Apple. And finally, I think people are realizing that these phones are surveillance devices, and much of it is used commercially to serve you ads, to discover, where people are congregating. But I think people are increasingly aware that you can share way too much information with Big Brother in the form of Silicon Valley. So a new poll by the Washington Post and University of Maryland shows that many people either don't have a smartphone and apparently don't want one or can't afford one. That's 1 in 6 Americans who don't have them. But even among those who carry a cell phone, 59% say they might be comfortable using an app if they tested positive for COVID-19. But when they're asked the broader question about whether they trust all this, well, 47% trust health insurance companies, 43% trust tech companies like Google and Apple. And one of the people polled, a Republican-leaning independent from Rigby, Idaho, says, I don't feel like they have a good track record of taking care of people's privacy and data. Now, among Americans overall, 41% say they both have a smartphone and are willing to use an infection tracking app. Now, you flip that around, that means 59% either don't have one or don't trust the use of this technology. Now, it is fair to say that there are many people who are just blasé about it. They've got nothing to hide. They don't have a paramour on the side or a secret place where they go that they don't want other people to know about. But the lurking fear that being tracked, I think, is growing, and I think that's a very, very healthy development. So in an article at the New York Times today, they talk about the use of these apps. The governor of North Dakota went to a friend of his who develops apps. And in North and South Dakota, we'll note that South Dakota has not imposed any restrictions and has a huge outbreak in the meatpacking plants there. Well, the reception has been chilly because only about 25,000 people in North Dakota, 3% of the population, have downloaded the state's app. And last month, Singapore, which is essentially a police state, introduced a voluntary, contact tracing app, but only about 20% of the population has downloaded it. People in Norway are a little more at ease. 30% of residents have signed up since their app was released about a week and a half ago. Now, those numbers certainly could grow, and the health officials, in my view, are colluding with the tech firms and the collectors of our data, saying, oh, come on, we'll only keep it for 30 days. We promise we'll destroy the data, but we want to be able to track, whose phone has been near your phone. And we're only going to use Bluetooth, not the GPS geolocation data. But who can trust these assertions and these warranties, these representations? So North Dakota's app does use Wi-Fi, cell towers, and GPS. It is not simply the Bluetooth system. But it means that it's much less accurate because GPS, at least in relation to publicly used cell phones, is only accurate, they say, to about 175 feet. So to me, that negates the value of that data while serving up information that could be used and abused for other purposes. So this is something I believe needs full discussion and debate and should not be crammed on a public, hoping that it is their ticket to safety from the virus, that it's what is going to permit them to go back to work, to hang out in restaurants and movie theaters, which are being opened in Texas. And so I think that this is a trend that is worth discussion, and I'm glad that more and more people are concerned about the invasions of what's left of our privacy. Separately, we learned today that an Israeli spyware company uses American servers and is deeply involved in carrying out mobile phone hacks of 1,400 WhatsApp users. Now, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, promises end-to-end encryption. And to its credit, Facebook has resisted efforts by the government to demand a backdoor. And I have WhatsApp on my phone. I use it occasionally for free phone calls to people in other countries. I don't use it so much for domestic communication. And, of course, I have nothing to hide. But this Israeli company is called the NSO Group, and new claims accuse the company of responsibility in serious human rights violations, including the hacking of more than a dozen Indian journalists and dissidents in Rwanda. The company says, well, look, we just sell this stuff. It's not up to us how people use it. And according to a lawsuit from WhatsApp, NSO gained unauthorized access to its servers by reverse engineering the messaging app and then evading the company's security features that prevent manipulation of the company's call features. One WhatsApp engineer who investigated the hack said in a sworn statement that in 720 instances, the IP address of a remote server was included in the malicious code used in the attacks. That remote server, the engineer said, was based in Los Angeles and owned by a company whose data center was used by NSO. So these are footprints. I can't call them hard evidence. But again, I warn you, whether you are using WhatsApp or other systems that you think are secure from hacking and official eavesdropping, don't believe it. Now, one of the rare defenders of our Fourth Amendment rights is a man I have real mixed feelings about. And he has just announced that he is exploring a run for president as a libertarian. You've heard me talk before about Justin Amash. He is a congressman from Michigan, I believe the Grand Rapids area. And last year, on July the 4th, he left the Republican Party. Now, that was after he helped form the Freedom Caucus, the far-right wing of the Republican members of the House. And so it's complicated. Because on the one hand, Justin Amash is one of a few in Congress who has opposed the expansive domestic surveillance of Americans in the United States. I'm being a little redundant there, but I want to be clear that this violates clearly the Fourth Amendment, which, unlike the Second Amendment and some of the other language in the Bill of Rights, can be subject to misinterpretation. And so, if he runs as a libertarian, which is the likely path, the Libertarian Party does have ballot access in most states. That's a big hurdle for most third-party candidates. And Republicans say that he could help Trump win. Democrats are mostly not commenting on this, but I'm not so sure, and I will withhold judgment until we see any polling data, because I think that Amash could be a vehicle for Republican protest votes. And as someone who doesn't support Joe Biden, I'm looking for a place for my vote. But I have to be clear that Justin Amash, before he made his move to becoming independent, is a far-right movement conservative, a low-tax liberty guy, big on the Second Amendment, as it is misinterpreted in my view. I believe he is anti-choice. And so on many issues, I would be loath to support him openly. But given these circumstances and the options available, I'm going to keep my options open for now. Now, one of the other issues that I respect Justin Amash for is that he and Tom Massey from Kentucky, the guy who pissed off absolutely everybody when he tried to demand a roll call vote in the House passage of the CARES Act, and he was outmaneuvered by Pelosi with a lot of support from Republicans like Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader. But Amash and Massey are both strong opponents of U.S. interventionist policy, the regime change wars, the meddling in Yemen in particular. And also coming from Michigan, Juan Cole, who's a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, a guy I've followed for years, interviewed many times, met him for coffee once in Ann Arbor. His blog often contains some very important news. And today he's reporting, and I believe Carl Howard tipped me to this, thank you, Carl, that there is a new fracture in Yemen among the parties who oppose the Saudi intervention and who are part of this complicated struggle for power in this impoverished nation. And the big takeaway here, I've linked to Professor Cole's post, and if you want to dig down into the details, feel free. But the simplest takeaway is that the new shuffle of these different factions, and it's a separatist movement in southern Yemen, indicates that Iran is nowhere to be seen. And Cole writes, the Saudis and the UAE have pushed the story for 5 years that they intervened in Yemen to stop Iran from taking it over. The Iranians, however, are nowhere in evidence, though they may have smuggled a few arms and some small amounts of money to the Houthi rebels. Instead, the dramatic conflict now is between the nationalists and the Southerners, who are both Sunni Arabs. In other news from the Middle East, Alison Weir, who is a respected critic of the apartheid policies of the State of Israel, reports over at Mint Press News today that Israel is considering using the COVID pandemic as a pretext to ask the United States for a double payment of the military funding that Obama increased to $3.8 billion a year. And they're asking that before October, they get this year's installment and the one from 2024. Now, they're not saying they'll forego next year's. And maybe they hope that by 2024, their bipartisan friends in Washington will just say, oh, forget about that. I mean, what's a $4 billion tab? So this suggests a couple of things to me, and this is, let me be clear, speculation. This money really can be used mostly to buy arms from United States manufacturers. And so it's not going to be used to slow the spread of the virus or develop a vaccine or treatments. It absolutely has nothing to do with the pandemic. So what are the possibilities? Well, Israel's been itching for a war with Iran for a long time. Maybe they feel the need to replenish their supply of U.S.-made cluster bombs or advanced fighter jets. There's also the move that they have telegraphed, and Benny Gantz doesn't oppose it in this new so-called unity government, that they want to annex the West Bank with Trump and Crown Prince Jared's approval as soon as this summer. And might they fear that there could be a ruckus where Iran, via Hezbollah, and the Palestinians in Gaza may erupt into a new regional war. Again, that is speculation, but what the hell does Israel have asking the U.S. to borrow more money to shovel it to them in a double payment this year? I'll leave that question to linger with you. Here's another use of the pandemic, and I commend reporter Akela Lacey at The Intercept for advancing the outrage that I expressed last week and in recent days that the Cuomo administration has canceled the presidential primary in New York State. And the pretext was, well, we don't want to expose all of Bernie's voters, or I guess Biden voters too, to force them to come out to the polls to vote. And of course, this will predictably lead to lower turnout, and there are a number of progressive candidates who need hefty turnout to prevail over the establishment corporate Dems. Now, that's not the only power grab that Cuomo has made. In the budget bill that was rammed through with little debate in, I believe, early April, well, they basically raised the barriers for the Working Families Party. Now, WFP qualifies for the ballot if they score 130,000 votes this November. But the new law raises that threshold to almost double. And that is a barrier to minor parties like the Conservative Party and others who want to try to launch third parties and more progressive wings like the WFP. And even a spokesman for Uber Democrat Chuck Schumer says Senator Schumer believes eliminating the WFP from the ballot only helps conservatives and weakens our ability to win races. But this is part of Cuomo's master plan. And I believe there are no term limits for governor in New York. He's now on his third round. Also in New York, Mayor de Blasio in New York City is being accused of anti-Semitism. Now, what he did is, on Tuesday, he personally went to the Williamsburg section in Brooklyn because there was a large funeral with many, many people, described in the thousands, who came out to honor Rabbi Chaim Metz, or do you say Chaim? Mertz, sorry. And he was pissed because the temple of the rabbi had assured him that they were going to keep the crowd small, maintain social distancing. But when de Blasio got to the scene after he heard reports, he basically blew his top. And he made some tweets. He said something absolutely unacceptable happened in Williamsburg tonight, a large funeral gathering in the middle of this pandemic. When I heard, I went there myself to ensure the crowd was dispersed, and what I saw will not be tolerated so long as we're fighting the coronavirus. And then this is the tweet that got him in trouble. My message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I've instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping this disease and saving lives, period. But because he mentioned the word Jewish, It triggers a kind of reflexive claim. And they used veiled language. A city council member, Chaim Deutsch, said, singling out one community is ridiculous. Every neighborhood has people who are being non-compliant. To speak to an entire ethnic group as though we are all flagrantly violating precautions is offensive, it's stereotyping, and it's inviting anti-Semitism. I'm truly stunned. Then Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the Anti-Defamation League. The few who don't social distance should be called out, but generalizing against the whole population is outrageous, especially when so many are scapegoating Jews. This erodes the very unity our city needs now more than ever. And so I recognize that this is a touchy issue. And I recommend that you read the article today by Matt Berman. He identifies as Jewish, and he offers a lot of the context that de Blasio has courted and enjoyed strong support from the Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. And they view this as a kind of betrayal. After all, according to this article by Berman, de Blasio has slow-walked efforts to impose restrictions related to Jewish practices. And Berman writes flatly that Bill de Blasio, regardless of what the president's eldest son and others who enjoy punching down at the oft-punched mayor suggest, is not anti-Semitic. He's clumsy and reflective of the frequently well-intentioned but dangerous thinking about Jews that has become increasingly popular in American politics. So on the one hand, Berman declares that de Blasio is not anti-Semitic, but I think he, in the next turn, justifies what I consider to be the excessive sensitivity. And I'm very sensitive myself when people wield anti-Semitism as a weapon that silences critics who are not antagonistic toward Jews, but who have serious and credible criticisms of the State of Israel. Here's today's coronavirus update, compiled by Linda Lewis. The worldwide reported death count attributed to COVID-19 is 225,000. In the U.S., we are just passing the 60,000 mark for deaths, with over 1 million reported cases. And we're getting some interesting, details about who the most likely victims are, with a report of nearly 70 dead. These are all veterans who were living at the Soldiers' Home in Holyoke, Massachusetts. We are seeing a pattern. For example, Gavin Newsom here in California, our governor, had really blocked the release of data on the number of nursing homes and senior care facilities that were the site of coronavirus-related deaths. And today, the numbers came out, and so far it's about 40%. And this, I think, indicates that we have very low standards for senior care. And as somebody who's heading into senior territory, I hope that I don't wind up in a facility. I have a cousin who's a nurse working in Virginia right now, and she has reported some pretty upsetting stories about the conditions in a facility. It's got 2,500 residents, and, it's got assisted living and unassisted living and then nursing home care. And I hope that we will take a hard look at this and upgrade the requirements, particularly for the commercially operated senior living facilities. One of the other data points that's coming out, this from Georgia, and as far as I know, Brian Kemp is not operating consistent with the very standards that Donald Trump pronounced as he droned on. When he goes to his performances, he frequently has an opening statement that's been written for him and we're told he's never seen before, and he mumbles and stumbles through it. Well, that's how he enunciated the standards, right, for what it takes to reopen. Well, in Georgia, a new survey shows that in a sample of 305 COVID-19 patients, more than 80% were African American, and that this ripples through to the rate of fatalities as well. And is it too cynical to suggest that Donald Trump thinks that old people, especially old black people, and the population who works at meatpacking plants where he has used the Defense Production Act that he was so reluctant to use to order ventilators and other medical equipment, does he view them as expendable? After all, many of the people who work in our meatpacking plants are immigrants, and some without legal status. And those are cynical questions. We'll revisit them when we have more data. Returning to Linda's report, Trump remains the king of blue sky. At Tuesday's briefing, would he just stop briefing? Now that our experts believe that the worst days of the pandemic are behind us, Americans are looking forward to the safe and rapid reopening of our country. He is such a compulsive con man. And The Hill wrote, Tuesday's event featured a parade of small business owners and employees who thanked the president and his administration for the Paycheck Protection Program, which we know is badly written, has been abused by much bigger corporate operations, and has left the true intended recipients, mom-and-pop businesses, with empty hands. Trump also said there were very good experts who predicted that the coronavirus outbreak would never affect the United States, and of course he's on the defensive because it has been revealed that he was frequently briefed in January and February on the potential dimensions of the problem. And one of the people he loathes the most, Jim Acosta from CNN, asked Trump about the number of cases passing the 1 million mark, pointing out that Trump said in February that the number would go down to 0. And Trump said, well, it will go down to 0 ultimately. Oh, man. And then he said, well, we're doing more testing than any other country in the world, but the level of testing, even in the states that are precipitously reopening, in my opinion, is dismally low. So Trump continues to maintain his bluster and his spin. And it was the Washington Post, that reported Monday that Trump got at least a dozen warnings about the coronavirus in daily briefings. Despite that, Trump failed to register the threat. And by the end of January, start of February, a majority of the intelligence contained in Trump's daily briefings was about the virus. So we're kind of getting two sides of our dear Dr. Fauci. Because on the one hand, he is saying that, if we reopen too soon, the virus could ramp back up. And he is also saying, in a speech at the Economic Club of Washington yesterday, the U.S. could be in for a bad fall if the coronavirus treatments don't start working soon. In my mind, it's inevitable that we'll have a return of the virus, or maybe even that it never went away, and that it's not going to disappear from the planet. So I understand the fine line he treads. When he's at those White House briefings, he can't appear to be criticizing Trump. And here he is clearly pushing back on the bullshit that Trump offers. But Fauci, on the other hand, I think is offering false praise for the latest clinical trials of remdesivir. We know that a study in China that was published in The Lancet and a non-peer-reviewed test in Chicago showed that remdesivir either didn't do anything or couldn't be proven to really cure people. But the latest study shows that It may shorten the course of the infection. And he seems to be sounding positive notes about that. That strikes me as a premature ejaculation. And then there is the word from Oxford University in England that human testing is underway on a vaccine that they've developed. It may be widely available by September. Now, Trump has predicted these early dates for a vaccine or a treatment, and Fauci has repeatedly batted them down. And so we wait for the truth to emerge from the soup that exists between Trump and Fauci. Now, many people are still waiting for their measly $1,200 stimulus checks. And, of course, people who have passed muster for unemployment are still waiting for their boosted checks, $600 a week from the feds. And we've learned that one of the delays is for Social Security recipients. They decided that they would make a list and then send it to the IRS to see who qualifies based on the means testing. And I think that kind of rules me out for one of these $1,200 checks, which is really, an advanced tax credit that many people will have to pay back. But one of the things that we're learning is that the IRS plans to mail up to 5 million paper checks a week, has created a schedule for mailing these payments if you meet the requirements. And if you haven't done it yet, you can probably speed the effort by going online and setting up for direct deposit with the IRS. Those payments come faster. But if you do that, you won't get one of these keepsake checks that has Trump's name on it. Now, it turns out that they did reject his idea to put his fancy signature from a Sharpie on any of these checks. And it simply has President Donald Trump printed on the check. I've also heard that he is in the works to mail out 90 million love letters to Americans under the pretext of some coronavirus message or some of these payments. And now step forward some lawyers who filed a suit saying that these actions to put Trump on these materials likely violate, in a criminal manner, the Hatch Act, which basically says you cannot use official communications to support your reelection. So in a letter to Attorney General Barr, President Trump is actively seeking reelection. The signature of Trump on the Treasury checks is superfluous to their value, legality, or authenticity. The signature serves no official purpose other than Trump's 2020 election campaign. So, Ralph Nader signed on to that, as well as Bruce Fein, a man I have some respect for. He's a constitutionalist who supported the impeachment of George W. Bush, and I believe has supported the impeachment of Trump. But he's also an unregistered lobbyist for the interests of the nation of Turkey. And in my view, that taints him in ways that, are beyond my standards. CBS News is reporting that loopholes for large publicly traded companies still exist in that Paycheck Protection Program. And because loans are based on the number of U.S. employees, companies can apply and game the system. One example is Culp, the largest domestic manufacturer of fabric for mattresses and other furniture. They have 1,500 employees, but they say that only about 500 of them are in the United States, the rest in China. And who really knows what those numbers are? So as it comes to these plans to reopen different states, public health experts are questioning the ability of reopening those states to monitor and handle the inevitable increase in cases that will follow. Dr. John Schwartzberg, clinical professor emeritus at UC Berkeley. I think they're playing Russian roulette, he said. They're hoping, obviously, that reopening the states is not going to lead to increased cases. They have no way of monitoring the answer to that question until it explodes, leading to hospitalizations and some deaths. So Texas is reopening. Would you go shopping at Macy's? Would you hit up a restaurant and lounge at a table there? Would you go to a movie theater, a mall, or stop by the library, even if they tell you that they're only permitted to operate at 25% capacity? So the other side of the coin in Texas is that by declaring the state partially opened and allowing certain businesses to call workers back, it is likely to trigger an end to their unemployment benefits. And that leaves people in the same category I described for the meatpacking industry, where Trump is ordering them open. The companies then can demand that people show up or quit. And those workers are left with the Hobson's choice. Do I get a paycheck and risk being infected and possibly dying? Or do I face financial ruin by listening to whatever concerns I still have? There's also an issue of access to child care. Even, as we head into the summer, schools are closed. Some schools will not reopen until September. And these are complex choices that families and the breadwinners need to make. Nancy Pelosi has announced her list of people who will be appointed to the Select Committee on the Coronavirus, monitoring the flow of all that money. And I'm happy to see that Donna Shalala didn't make the cut. She's the former Health and Human Services director who got a seat in Congress in 2018 in Florida. And I want to credit Brad Friedman, my longtime buddy, who dug into her conflicts, including that she served on the board of a health insurance company and continues to own stock in that same firm. So I have two reports on a meeting at the White House between the Democratic governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, and the president. And the report from the New York Times is that John Bel Edwards is saying that Louisiana is not ready to reopen, and he has extended the restrictions at least until May 15th. But the spin from the White House, as reported by The Guardian, is that Trump, in meeting with John Bel Edwards, said that the guidelines will be relaxed as states start to look toward reopening their economies. I'm very much in favor of what they're doing, Trump said. They're getting it going. Now, scratch your head and take yourself back just 1 week when Trump unloaded on Governor Kemp of Georgia, appropriately, I think, for saying, well, no, it's too soon. But in Trump's mind, a week ago is a million tweets. And none of that matters. The Trump administration also plays a double game as the president's personal lawyer, who also cavorts as the Attorney General, Bill Barr. He is investigating prosecution of different states for shutting down churches. And we know that the Trump administration is always on God's side. And this is infuriating because Barr uses the language to slight those of us who are described as secularists. And he said that, these people take pleasure in denying the rights of people of faith. Here's the quote. Barr has painted a picture of a country split between secularists who seem to take a delight in compelling people to violate their conscience and people of faith. Now, what this sets up is faith-based exceptionalism. That your right to claim a God and your practices of worship overrules the concerns of the entire population. And in particular, that government needs to defer to people who describe themselves as bathed in the blood of Jesus and allow them to put the general population at risk by congregating, whether it is the Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn or the Bible-thumping Christians in the South. And get this, Tony Perkins, chief of the God Squad over there at the Family Research Council. At the end of this month, we'll be at 45 days since the president first issued his guidelines. God only kept Moses on the mountain for 40 days. I didn't make this up. I mean, what kind of rational thought is that to make a comparison of that sort? Hey, I want to pause for a moment to give out $100. And this money was contributed by listeners to the Peter B. Collins podcast, many people who've made direct contributions, others who have permitted me to use their subscription funds to build the Peter B. Collins Community Fund. And today, we're going to award $100, a grant, to a woman named Sherry in Humboldt County. Her car was stolen a couple of years ago. She has to rely on intermittent public transportation and barely has enough money to get by. And I want to thank Billy Cook for bringing her situation to my attention, and that $100 would help her get stocked up on groceries and other needed supplies. Sherry, $100 is on the way. I'm going to write a check and put it in the mail to you today. And we don't need to share your last name because some people, are a little bit shy about asking for help. And I recognize that, and I want to encourage you to come forward. If $100 could make a big change for you this week or next week, I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like to send you the money. All you have to do is email Peter at peterbcollins.com. If you don't like email or you don't have it, you can drop me a letter in the mail to Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. My offer applies to non-Americans as well. And I deeply want to thank the people who have been so generous in contributing to this fund. So let's see if we can help some more people. So Frank Bruni is a guy who writes opinion for the New York Times, and like so many people with opinions, yourself and myself included, sometimes I agree with him, and sometimes I don't. So Bruni uses the headline today, "They didn't drink the bleach, but they're still drinking the Kool-Aid." And let me just pause to note that I never used that phrase myself, because it was Jim Jones in the People's Temple in Guyana who drank that Kool-Aid in a mass suicide that also led to the shooting death of Congressman Leo Ryan and the significant injuries to one of his staff members, who is now Congresswoman Jackie Speer, a woman I have a lot of admiration for. And here in San Francisco, when the news broke of that Kool-Aid suicide, it was heartbreaking. Too many people knew people who were there at Jonestown. All right, that aside, I actually think it's appropriate in this context for Bruni to use the Kool-Aid metaphor. And he applies it to the Republicans who continue to enable their crazy president. Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Kevin McCarthy are called out in particular. And he calls out Republican leaders in general who should be calling out Trump and challenging him. And he writes, Joe Biden may not be their cup of tea, but that's no excuse to keep drinking Trump's Kool-Aid. The Pentagon is slowing down and maybe just trying to gum to death the recommendation from the Navy investigators that led to their recommendation that Captain Brett Crozier should be reinstated as captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier. Now, they've kicked it down and demanded a broader explanation of what happened on the Roosevelt, and it's clear they're afraid of our dear tweeter. Two bits of news about the manufacturing of passenger airliners. Boeing has announced that due to its own blunders and the predicted downturn in demand for passenger planes, they're going to lay off 16,000 people here in the United States. Revenue dropped 26% in the first 3 months of the year, but, they damaged themselves with the rush to deploy the 737 MAX, two of which have crashed, leading to deaths in the, about 100 in each case. And meanwhile, the consortium in Europe that builds passenger airliners, Airbus, is reeling, reporting a net loss of $520 million in the first quarter, and they weren't able to deliver planes. The airlines don't want them, and the trend is certainly downward for the foreseeable future. Yesterday, I offered some criticism of the Washington Post because they ducked the Joe Biden accuser, Tara Reade's story of sexual assault when she was a staffer to Senator Joe Biden in 1993. And today, I think they made up for it a bit because they put their own reporters on it instead of just publishing a piece from the Associated Press. And it leads, Joe Biden faced growing calls from Democrats to address claims by Tara Reade, a former aide who has accused Biden of sexually assaulting her in the early 1990s. Now, why couldn't they report this 6 weeks ago when Bernie Sanders was still in the race? They waited until the Sunday after Bernie bailed, Easter Sunday, to publish the first accounts of Tara Reade's credible accusations. And they go into the detail of what I've reported here about Business Insider and the reports of further corroboration from two women who at different times were told by Tara Reade. Then there's that phone call to Larry King Live by Reade's mom. And it is making Democrats squirm. And the Post zeroes in on that. Some Democrats said that Biden's campaign denials were insufficient given the explosiveness of the assault accusation. And let's credit Gilda Cobb Hunter, president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators from South Carolina. She plans to support Biden, but she said, I don't want to minimize what happened to her. I've spent too many years doing this work to do that. I think he needs to say something forceful so we can try to put it behind us. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. But she went on to say, I think people ought to be careful being too declarative about what did or did not happen if they weren't there. The campaign needs to be careful about being definitive if it says it didn't happen. And Claire Sandberg, former national organizing director for the Sanders presidential campaign, there is simply no moral justification for Biden to continue as the presumptive nominee. Out of respect for survivors and the good of the country, he should withdraw from the race. Now, this is the kind of coverage that I can call journalism. They're actually citing people who have strong views about this, including that Biden is damaged by this and should pull out of the race. All right. On the other hand, we get Kirsten Gillibrand, the champion of women in the military who complain of sexual assault. She, of course, still carries a lot of baggage from Democrats who are bitter that she pressured Al Franken to resign for allegations that did not amount to, sexual violence or, sexual assault. It was inappropriate touching, kissing, and that time when he faked grabbing the breasts of a sleeping woman on a USO tour plane. Gillibrand's trusting Joe, Vice President Biden, has vehemently denied these allegations. I support Vice President Biden. Now, many people are ducking the question, including Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris. They all want to be Joe's VP. And I was really disappointed last night because I have a high regard for Stacey Abrams, who came close to beating Brian Kemp for the governorship in Georgia, and he stole it from her. But she was making the rounds on several programs last night, and to her credit, she was willing to answer the question. But to her discredit, she said, well, I believe women should be heard, I believe Joe Biden, and that this was investigated by the New York Times, and that's good enough for me. Well, that's before the additional corroboration surfaced, and Stacey Abrams knows that. And it's AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been most forthcoming. We quoted this before when she said it. I think it's legitimate to talk about these things. You can't say, both believe women, support all of this, until it inconveniences you, until it inconveniences us. So we need a full dialogue on this. Also, at the Washington Post today, a little bit unusual, they assigned their fact-checker, Glenn Kessler. And he went through and gives a detailed account of the original allegations from Tara Reade, from the recent corroboration offered by the two women, one a neighbor, one a co-worker, Linda Lacasse and Lorraine Sanchez, and then offers no conclusion. Usually the fact-checker assigns Pinocchios. Trump gets 4, which is the maximum all the time. But in this case, they just kind of end the report. Now, that's better than nothing. And again, the Post is doing much better coverage of this than the Times is. And I want to recommend a piece over at BuzzFeed. I found it there today. And they picked up the talking points coming from the Biden campaign. Let's credit Ruby Kramer and Rosie Gray, BuzzFeed reporters. So the Biden campaign has circulated talking points among top Democratic supporters, and they issued them right after the Easter Sunday. It wasn't in the Sunday paper. They posted it later in the day. And the talking points show that while Biden has stayed quiet on the allegations, aides were taking the claims seriously enough behind the scenes to coordinate messaging among other Democrats. And the talking points here are what we heard from Stacey Abrams on TV last night. And so here's a statement from the article. Democrats are in an increasingly precarious position as reporters assess Reade's allegation. By any measure of the Me Too movement that has been seen since the Democratic Party embrace, believe women as a mantra, Reade, age 56, has provided a serious account, disputed by Biden's campaign and former senior staffers, but corroborated in part by people she told about the incident in the 1990s. And this is my comment again, that I find her more credible and convincing than Christine Blasey Ford's accusations against a teenager named Brett Kavanaugh, who likes beer. And BuzzFeed points out, since news outlets began to investigate her claims, Biden has participated in more than a dozen television shows, but nobody's bothered to ask him about it. Now that shows collusion in the corporate media. They are protecting Joe Biden in a bubble of not asking him a question that he doesn't want to answer. They also note that the reporter for Business Insider, Rich McHugh, is an investigative journalist who worked as a producer for the NBC reporting of Ronan Farrow into Harvey Weinstein, and that's the reporting that NBC refused to broadcast. So Rich McHugh has some cred in investigating these sorts of matters. Also, I have stayed out of the speculation over who Biden is going to pick as his VP because he gets to make the choice. It'll be rubber stamped by the DNC if there is a convention or not. And speculating about it is just a waste of time. And in a piece about the endorsement that Hillary Clinton delivered to Joe Biden yesterday, Alan McLeod delves into some of that speculation and saying, wow, is Hillary going to return to the White House as the VP with Joe Biden? And if Biden picks Hillary, I think that will seal the deal and be the kiss of death. But other Democrats think she's still viable, and they're bitter over her loss in 2016 because, the Russians. But here is the thing that is buried in McLeod's account. The endorsement occurred yesterday at a women's town hall. And you've got Biden and Hillary sitting a couple of feet away, la distancia. But he links to a short video clip and writes, Biden also appeared to momentarily fall asleep as Clinton was talking. Yes, her endorsement of him was so riveting that he dozed off. And I looked at the footage, and boy, those eyelids were heavy, heavy, heavy. And like a good high school student catching a nap, he kept his head and shoulders up. But his facial expressions indicate that he did check out. at least for a moment. You remember Chris Kobach of Kansas, one of the favorite targets of Greg Palast, the guy who ran the interstate cross-check list to suppress voters? And as Kansas Secretary of State, he imposed really strict photo IDs. You needed a birth certificate or a passport. Well, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, upholding a lower court ruling from 2018, upheld a lower court ruling from 2016, and said that there isn't the kind of voter fraud in Kansas to justify the law as Kobach had claimed. At most, 39 non-citizens had registered to vote in Kansas over the last 19 years. And the court explained that this did not justify the burden placed on 30,000 voters. Chalk one up as a loss for Chris Kobach. And finally today, I want to spend a couple of minutes on this. On Monday, I recommended that people take a look at the new documentary. It's produced by Michael Moore, but it was directed and written by a longtime environmentalist whose name is Jeff Gibbs. And as I've told you, I have been pressing for an interview with Jeff Gibbs or Michael Moore to discuss this, and I hope to get that interview and bring it to you soon. But there has been a whole wave of criticism, and I call it the circling of the green wagons. People who've argued that this film should be withdrawn. They argue for censorship. And a listener who asked not to be identified, and I'll honor that, sent me a message today. Peter, I'm a huge fan of yours. I listen to your podcast every day, but your take on Michael Moore's new climate change movie is so far off, it borders on dangerous. I was going to let it go, but when you doubled down today, I felt compelled to write. That's yesterday. Please take the time to read the 4 or 5 well-researched and cited posts I've shared on my wall this week, calling out the lies, technology misrepresentations, and journalistic malpractice, to use one of your favorite phrases, that permeate the film. Yes, there are good points, but when buried in falsehoods, those fall away to meaningless. All right, I accept that people have different points of view. And I think that people have a reverence for climate change leaders, activists on the environment, Bill McKibben in particular. I do understand that. But I believe you've got to pull off those green wool blinders that are over your eyes and take a hard look, because I'm going to review another one of the well-circulated critiques, this one that was posted on April 26 by Kathy Cowan Becker. Kathy Cowan Becker. And I'll link to it in the show file. It's over at Medium. And it's quite lengthy, 27 pages. And it is similar to the piece that I cited yesterday from the professor at UC Santa Barbara, which is that the critics basically project what they think the film should have been about. They think it should have criticized big oil and the climate deniers. They think it should look at the narrower picture of the benefits, and there are benefits of different types of non-carbon power. But the film takes, I think, a bigger view, and it looks at the big picture of whether the burning of carbon to create alternative energy does have a net positive effect. And the film doesn't use a lot of data points or graphs. It's mostly a personal argument. And I believe that Gibbs presented what I referred to yesterday as a lament, much more than an indictment. So Becker here writes, one way of getting our society to be less based on consumption is to change how we measure economic health. And she creates this whole argument that is reasonable. And she says, do Moore and his longtime collaborator Jeff Gibbs explore any of this? No. Well, come on. You can go out and make your own documentary and make all the arguments that you want. But to create this straw man, that because they didn't include arguments that are important to you, that the film fails, I'm sorry, that is not, to me, a compelling or rational view. And they often attack the film because Gibbs says we have too many people on the planet and we're consuming too much. And they criticize him for not saying how he would reduce the population. Again, that is not the point. But people project that onto him and say, well, he failed because he didn't tell us what gruesome method, like China's, one-child policy or some sort of eugenics. Well, again, that is a false way of undermining the film. Here we go with another argument. Instead of exploring various questions, Planet of the Humans spends most of its time attacking the major solution to lowering carbon emissions, renewables, and the environmentalists and groups that spend their time trying to get our government to move toward clean energy. In doing so, the film repeats some of the ugliest climate denial tropes and provides fodder to the worst climate denial groups in the country. It's no accident that Josh Fox and others are speaking out forcefully while paid industry shills like Myron Abell are praising it. Now, I've interviewed Myron Abell. He's from that phony think tank called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's a denialist and a fatuous bullshitter. But the fact that he is praising this is simply to advance his own agenda. And instead of honestly reflecting on the loving critique that Jeff Gibbs provides, we see many in the Green movement moving to try to dismiss this and to, I think, turn it into a false argument, when I think he makes a strong case that there are misrepresentations by those who advance renewables as the solution. And in every one of these pieces, there are concessions. That, he's right about this, and the biofuels, that whole biomass thing is largely an illusion. And so here's another one. Another point not mentioned in the film is that when an energy plant of any sort is proposed, including a solar or wind plant, it must undergo environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. There has to be an environmental assessment, often a lengthy environmental impact statement. Well, come on. There are many of these projects that get approved through sleight of hand, through payoffs, through political lobbying and influence. And, of course, that is conveniently left out of these critiques. Then Becker writes about yet another denialist talking point promulgated in Planet of the Humans is the idea that if you have to use fossil fuels to do anything with renewable energy, that cancels out the gains you might make from renewables. I can't count the number of times I've been told, if you heat your house, drive a car, or use any manufactured product, you're a hypocrite for supporting renewables because all of that involves fossil fuels. Well, duh. As Leah Stokes, that's the woman I responded to yesterday, as she put it, that's why it's called a clean energy transition. You move away from fossil fuels by making clean energy. Eventually, the entire system is clean energy. But that's the point of the film, that eventually is not likely to be achieved, particularly in time to address the timelines of the continued warming of the planet and the potential for human extinction, which Guy McPherson on our program said could be as soon as 2030. So then Becker gets to Planet of the Humans does raise good points in two areas regarding the energy transition, gas plants and biofuels. And they acknowledge that natural gas, while it burns much cleaner than coal, fracking to extract it, and the methane that is released at the wellheads, which is often 100 times as potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. That's right here in Becker's statement. And to my listener who wrote in, you know who you are, please understand that these concessions are in the very arguments that you say support the denunciation of this film, and you didn't implicitly say that you wanted to see it banned or withdrawn or censored. But many of these critics do. So I'm going to stop there for today. There is more in Becker's piece, but 27 pages is too much for anybody to handle. And I have two more critiques that have just been published in the last 24 hours. I will review them tonight, and I'll offer my comments in an upcoming podcast. Because I do want to be fair, I want to engage in an honest exchange, but I want those of you who are defending the whole green movement to open your eyes and open your minds, and don't be afraid of criticism. We'll all be better off if we do. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Hey, Roy, tone it down, will you? You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.